Wingless Dreamer presents Brief History of Indian Poetry. India, being a land of linguistically and culturally diverse communities, amalgamated by a long history, has a literature that is just as diverse and culturally nuanced. It is a literature of adaptations, of translations, of tellings and retellings, of verbal odes made into long verses of written poetry. Dating as far back as the Vedas, which are believed to be of divine origin and first penned down between 1500 and 1200 BCE, the trajectory of Indian poetry is filled with twists and turns. To span a history all the way from the Vedas to the poetry of writers such as Nissim Ezekiel in such a short attempt, especially including all the major cultures of the country, is nearly impossible. So, we'll be looking at four important periods of Indian history and some of the personalities that are regarded as the faces of these eras. Ancient India. Let's start with the epic poetry written in Sanskrit. The two most widely known epics are the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Both of these texts have reached global recognition, with several translations having been attempted over the recent years. Ramayana, presumed to have been written by Valmiki between the 7th and the 4th century BCE, depicts the story of Rama's life, his birth, his education, his marriage, his subsequent exile, and the war that takes place during the period of this exile. It is written in narrative verse, formally arranged into couplets. The text consists of 24,000 verses and is divided into 7 sections. The other epic, Mahabharata, first written by Vyas around 400 BCE, tells the story of two sets of brothers, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and the long brewing war that takes place over a surprisingly short period of 18 days. Similar to the Ramayana, the Mahabharata also features couplets of narrative verse. The first version of the text was shorter, but the later additions resulted in a revised version that ended up making the text around 200,000 lines long. The second most prominent era of ancient Indian history was the era of Kalidas. A classic and an irreplaceable name in the pages of the history of Indian literature, Kalidas, living between the 4th and the 5th century CE, was one of the first to write works of poetry based on the characters of Hindu mythology. His epic poetry includes Kumar Sambhava and Raghuvansha. Kumar Sambhava describes the anticipation of the birth of Kartikeya. And Raghuvansha is a poem describing the dynasty of Ram. His other poetry includes Meghaduta, set in the Mandakranta meter. In this meter, the first four, the 10th, the 11th, the 13th, the 14th, and the 17th syllables of a foot are heavy, while the rest of the syllables are light. To illustrate, let's read the opening lines of the text. Forgive my reading ability, I am not very great at reading Sanskrit. Kaschit kanta viraha guruna स्वाधिकारात् प्रमुक्तः शापेनास्तंगमितमहिमा वर्षभोग्येन भर्तुः यक्षश्चक्रे जनकतनया स्नानपुण्योदकेषु स्निग्धच्छायातरुष वसति रामग्रीयाश्रमेषु. Poetry in ancient India was written with extensive knowledge of meter and form, elucidated in the Natya Shastra, and much of Sanskrit poetry follows meter as prescribed in this Natya Shastra. Ancient literature also bloomed in other languages like Meitei, that is Manipuri. Two prominent works of literature in this language include the Poiritong Kuntok and the Numit Kappa. The story of the Numikapa is the story of the sun and a star as two brothers, composed mostly of poetic hymns. Let's move on to medieval India. The next major milestone that the mainstream literature hit was the poetry of Kabir. Evidence indicates that he lived between 1400 and 1500 CE, and his writings were a contributor to the religious movements happening in India around him. He was a mystic and a critic, well ahead of his time in his critique of religious malpractices and misbeliefs. He wrote in Sadhu Kadi, a dialect of Hindi, and also in Bhojpuri. Most of his poetry was devotional or concerned with mysticism. He is most well known for his dohe, a term which translates to couplets. These were usually about faith and about human behavior. Some of them have a tone of advice meant to guide the reader to better practices in life. His poetry is formed through influences of both Hinduism and Islam, although he does not assert himself as being a follower of either religion. Let's read one of his dohas. भक्त मरे क्या रोइए जो अपने घर जाए रोइए साकट बापुरे हाटो हाट बिकाए meaning, don't cry for the devotee who upon death is going to his own house. Instead, cry for those who are ignorant and those who do not believe, whose death will lead them to be sold in the market. Tulsidas was another poet, born in 1511 and living up to 1623, who was a Hindu poet and a devotee of Rama. He lived in Banaras and Ayodhya and is well known for his verses of the Hanuman Chalisa, that is the 40 verses of Hanuman, and for his Ramacharitramanas, which was a retelling of the Valmiki Ramayana in the vernacular language. Fun fact, some believe him to be a reincarnation of Valmiki due to his devotion to Rama. His other poetry includes works like Ratna Ramayana, a collection of over 300 verses divided into sections. He is also credited with writing dohas similar to Kabir. Medieval Indian poetry was largely written in vernacular languages such as Hindi, Bhojpuri, Awadhi, and Urdu. The prominence of Sanskrit literature had lessened. The major themes of this era were asceticism, religious devotion, and biographical representations of the Mughal rulers. Classics from ancient India were revived and adapted in poetry. All in all, it was a period of rejuvenation and preservation of the old, and a gradual increase in the creation of the new. The pre independence colonial poetry. In the 15th to 19th century, Indian literature took a turn towards the language of the colonizers. By the 1800s, Indian poets were writing poetry in English. This early poetry attempted to imitate the English form while exploring subjects special to India. The treatment of the subjects, however, was largely an imitation of their English contemporaries. The early Indian poetry in English took on an Orientalist perspective to describe the marvelous in India, to describe the supposed exoticism of India as seen through the eyes of the Indian. The second phase of Swords was a transitional period where Indian writers tried to balance the influence of the English form over their poetry and their desire to pursue subjects that were more political. Coinciding with the independence struggle, this period saw social reformers emerging as poets. Rabindranath Tagore, born in 1861 and living up to 1941, was one of the most prominent pre independence poets, and we have a more detailed video about him on our channel. His poetry focused on themes of faith, myths, and beauty. He was also a political writer, playwright, and an educationist. Most of his writings are in Bengali and have been translated into English. An excerpt from his work Gitanjali is perhaps a good way to appreciate his writing style. It, it reads, Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it with ever fresh life. Another prominent writer during this era was Sarojini Naidu. Born in 1879, she was a political activist and later went on to become the first female governor in a newly independent India. Her writing took the form of lyric poetry and is rich with the description of the beauty of the mundane. Her works include The Golden Threshold, The Bird of Time, The Broken Wing, and many more. Let's take a look at an excerpt from her poem, Bangle Seller, which is a personal favorite of mine. Bangle sellers are we who bear our shining loads to the temple fair. Who will buy these delicate, bright, rainbow tinted circles of light, lustrous token of radiant lives for happy daughters and happy wives? The last thing we'll be looking at is post independence Indian poetry. Sarojini Naidu is a perfect example of the changing sentiments of Indian poetry. With the rise of postcolonialism and postmodernism, Indian poetry took on a blatant political note. Writers like Kamala Das and Nassim Ezekiel are some of the most prominent writers of the era. Kamala Das, born in 1934 with the name Kamala Suraya, was famous for her works in Malayalam and English. She wrote most of her poetry in English on what were considered bold topics at the time, such as female sexuality, childcare, politics. Her poetry also includes topics like love and heartbreak. Her conversion to Islam shocked people and made her a controversial personality, but she continued to write about the topics that she wanted to speak about. Her works of poetry include Summer in Calcutta, The Descendants, and more. Nassim Ezekiel is sometimes called the father of post colonial Indian poetry. He was an influential writer and was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award for his poetry in 1983. His works include A Time to Change, The Deadly Man, The Exact Name, and more. His poetry was a medium of change in India's approach, broadening the horizons of post colonial Indian literature. He made ample use of symbolism and experimented with forms and meter. Other writers like Jayanta Mahapatra, A.K. Ramanujan, Eunice D'Souza, and more are also part of the canon of post colonial Indian literature. Today, Indian poetry is rich with the influences of 1,000 years of history and has become not only a booming career path but also a way for people to express their political and personal sentiments. Thank you.